When Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970, the world lost the greatest guitarist who ever lived. He was only 27 years old. His death shocked the music world and devastated a generation that had seen him as a prophet of sound and freedom. His funeral in Seattle drew thousands of mourners. Eric Clapton sent a wreath. Miles Davis sent his respects. Fellow musicians and fans lined the streets to say goodbye to the man who had set his guitar on fire and changed music forever. Yet one person was conspicuously absent. Bob Dylan had given Jimi Hendrix one of his greatest gifts. In 1968, Hendrix had recorded a cover of Dylan's song All Along the Watchtower. The cover had become more famous than Dylan's original. It introduced Dylan's poetry to a whole new audience. Dylan himself said that Hendrix's version was definitive. After hearing what Jimi did with it, Dylan started playing it Hendrix's way. The two men had shared something profound through music, even if they barely knew each other personally. But when Hendrix was laid to rest in his hometown, Dylan sent nothing. No flowers, no telegram, no statement. He did not attend the funeral. He did not publicly acknowledge that one of music's brightest lights had been extinguished. Why would Bob Dylan stay silent when the man who had transformed his song into an anthem was gone? The answer reveals a complicated truth about artistic connection and personal distance, and the burden of being a living legend who wants nothing more than to disappear. The poet and the prophet, different worlds. Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix came from completely different musical universes. Dylan had emerged in the early 1960s from the Greenwich Village folk scene in New York. He was a poet with a guitar. His early songs were acoustic protests against war and injustice. He sang about civil rights and nuclear weapons and the changing times. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and The Times They Are A-Changin' became anthems for a generation trying to make the world better. Dylan was intellectual and literary. He drew inspiration from Woody Guthrie and the Beat Poets. His voice was raw and nasally, but his words were what mattered. He was a storyteller and a prophet who used music to deliver messages. Jimi Hendrix came from a completely different place. He was born in Seattle and grew up poor. He learned guitar by listening to blues records. He played in small clubs and backed up R&B singers on the Chitlin circuit. Hendrix was not intellectual in the traditional sense. He was instinctive. He heard sounds in his head that no one else could hear, and then he figured out how to make his guitar produce those sounds. When he moved to England in 1966 and formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience, he exploded onto the scene. His playing was revolutionary. He used feedback and distortion and wah-wah pedals to create textures that had never existed before. He played guitar with his teeth and behind his back. He set his instrument on fire at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. Hendrix was pure electricity and raw emotion. By the late 1960s, Dylan and Hendrix represented two sides of the counterculture. Dylan was the cerebral side, the poetry and the meaning. Hendrix was the visceral side, the experience and the sound. Dylan's fans analyzed his lyrics looking for hidden meanings. Hendrix's fans lost themselves in the music and let it wash over them. Both men were geniuses, but they operated in different dimensions. They moved in different circles. Dylan was surrounded by folkies and poets and political activists. Hendrix hung out with rock stars and blues players and psychedelic explorers. Their worlds overlapped in the sense that they were both part of the 1960s music revolution, but they were not friends. They were not even really acquaintances. All along the Watchtower, the connection. The connection between Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix came through a song. In late 1967, Dylan released an album called John Wesley Harding. It was a stripped-down acoustic album that came after a period of silence. Dylan had been in a motorcycle accident in 1966 and had retreated from public life. When he returned with John Wesley Harding, it was quieter and more introspective than his previous electric albums. One of the songs on the album was All Along the Watchtower. It was a mysterious song with biblical imagery. Two riders approaching, a joker and a thief, princes watching from a tower, the wind beginning to howl. Dylan's version was stark, just acoustic guitar and bass and some light drums. It was haunting but understated. Jimi Hendrix heard the song and was mesmerized. He understood immediately that it was more than just a folk song. It was a vision. It needed electricity and power. It needed to explode. In early 1968, Hendrix went into the studio and recorded his version of All Along the Watchtower. He completely transformed it. He added searing electric guitar, a driving bass line, crashing drums. His guitar work was some of the most expressive he ever recorded. The solo sounded like it was crying and screaming and searching for something beyond reach. Hendrix turned Dylan's quiet meditation into an apocalyptic anthem. When the song was released as a single, it became a massive hit. It reached number 20 on the Billboard charts. For many people, especially younger rock fans, this was their introduction to Bob Dylan's songwriting. Bob Dylan heard Hendrix's version and was blown away. He later said in interviews that Hendrix had taken his song to another dimension, that Hendrix had heard something in the song that Dylan himself had not fully realized. Dylan started performing All Along the Watchtower Live using Hendrix's arrangement instead of his own. This was extraordinary. Dylan was notoriously protective of his work. He rarely acknowledged that anyone else's version of his songs was superior. But with Hendrix, he made an exception. He admitted that Hendrix owned that song now. It was an acknowledgement of Hendrix's genius and his unique ability to see inside music and pull out its deepest truths. Despite this musical connection, the two men never became close. They met a few times at industry events and festivals. The encounters were brief and awkward. Dylan was shy and uncomfortable with small talk. Hendrix was in awe of Dylan and did not know what to say. There are stories of them being at the same party and Dylan leaving early, of Hendrix wanting to talk to Dylan about music but never finding the right moment. They inhabited the same musical universe, but they were like planets in different orbits. They influenced each other from a distance, but they never truly connected on a personal level. Dylan's disappearing ACT, 1966 to 1970. To understand why Dylan did not attend Hendrix's funeral, you have to understand where Dylan was mentally and emotionally in the late 1960s. In July 1966, Dylan had been in a motorcycle accident near his home in Woodstock, New York. The details of the accident have always been murky. Dylan claimed it was serious. Others said it was minor. But what is clear is that Dylan used the accident as an excuse to withdraw from public life. He had been touring relentlessly. He had gone electric in 1965 and faced hostile audiences who booed him for betraying folk music. He was exhausted and burned out and possibly addicted to amphetamines. The accident gave him permission to stop. For the next year and a half, Dylan barely appeared in public. He stayed in Woodstock with his wife Sarah and their growing family. He recorded music in a basement with a group of musicians who would later become the band. These recordings would eventually be released as the basement tapes, but at the time they were just for fun. Dylan was rediscovering his love of music by removing all the pressure and expectation. He grew a beard. He gained weight. He dressed like a regular guy instead of a hip musician. He wanted to be normal. He wanted to disappear. When Dylan did return to the public eye, it was on his own terms. John Wesley Harding in 1967 was quiet and mysterious. Nashville Skyline in 1969 was a country album that confused many of his fans. Dylan was deliberately making himself less cool, less relevant to the counterculture. He did not want to be a spokesman for a generation anymore. He did not want to be a prophet or a leader. He just wanted to make music and live his life. He avoided interviews. He avoided television appearances. He avoided benefit concerts and political rallies. While the world was exploding with protests against the Vietnam War and civil rights struggles, Dylan retreated into domesticity. This withdrawal frustrated many people. Activists wanted Dylan to use his voice to support causes. Fans wanted him to tour and perform. Critics wanted him to explain himself, but Dylan refused to play the game. He became almost impossible to reach. He surrounded himself with a small circle of trusted people and shut everyone else out. By 1970, Dylan was a recluse who occasionally released albums but otherwise lived like he was not famous at all. This was the context when Jimi Hendrix died. September 18, 1970, the day the music died. On September 18, 1970, Jimi Hendrix was found dead in a London apartment. He had choked on his own vomit after taking sleeping pills and drinking wine. He was 27 years old. The news sent shockwaves through the music world. Hendrix had been at the peak of his powers. He had just performed at the Isle of Wight Festival. He was working on new music that pushed even further into experimental territory. He seemed unstoppable, and now he was gone. The circumstances of his death were tragic and sordid. He had been staying with a girlfriend in London. He had taken too many sleeping pills. There were questions about whether it was an accident or intentional. The details were messy and sad, but what was clear was that the world had lost an irreplaceable talent. Hendrix had only been recording professionally for 4 years. He had released 3 studio albums with the Jimi Hendrix Experience and was working on a 4th. In that short time, he had completely changed what people thought was possible with an electric guitar. He had influenced everyone from Eric Clapton to Pete Townshend to Carlos Santana. He was the standard by which all rock guitarists would be measured. The funeral was held on October 1, 1970 in Seattle, Washington, where Hendrix had grown up. His body was flown back from London. Thousands of people lined the streets of Seattle as the funeral procession made its way to Dunlawton Baptist Church. Inside the church, the service was attended by family and friends and musicians who had known Hendrix. Outside, fans gathered to mourn and celebrate his life. The service included performances of his music. People shared memories of his kindness and his talent. It was a celebration of a life cut tragically short. Eric Clapton, who had been a friend and rival of Hendrix's, sent flowers. Miles Davis, who had been influenced by Hendrix's experimental approach, sent his condolences. Musicians from across the spectrum of rock and blues and jazz acknowledged the loss. But Bob Dylan sent nothing. He made no public statement. He did not acknowledge Hendrix's death at all. For someone whose song had been so transformed by Hendrix, the silence was deafening. The answer why Dylan did not attend. Bob Dylan did not attend Jimi Hendrix's funeral for reasons that were deeply rooted in his personality and his philosophy about fame and public life. The most obvious reason was that Dylan and Hendrix were not friends. They had met briefly a handful of times. They had never hung out socially. They had never collaborated in the studio. Their connection was purely through the song All Along the Watchtower. That connection was profound musically, but it did not create a personal relationship. Dylan did not attend funerals of people he did not know personally. He barely attended funerals of people he did know. Dylan was intensely private and uncomfortable with public displays of emotion. Dylan's reclusiveness in 1970 was also a major factor. He was living in Woodstock and trying to maintain a normal family life. He avoided anything that would put him back in the spotlight. Attending Jimi Hendrix's funeral would have been a major media event. Photographers would have swarmed him. Reporters would have asked for statements about Hendrix and about music and about the 1960s. Dylan would have become part of the story. The funeral would have been about Bob Dylan attending Jimi Hendrix's funeral instead of just about honoring Jimi Hendrix. Dylan knew this, and he wanted no part of it. His absence was a way of avoiding the spectacle. There was also a philosophical element to Dylan's absence. Dylan had a complicated relationship with the idea of martyrdom and tragedy in rock and roll. He had survived the 1960s when many of his peers had not. He had avoided the drug overdoses and the crashes and the early deaths that claimed so many talented people. Dylan believed in survival, in moving forward, in not dwelling on death and loss. He did not sentimentalize tragedy. When other musicians died, Dylan typically did not comment publicly. This was not because he did not care. It was because he believed that making public statements about death was performative and false, that real grief was private, that the best way to honor someone was to keep making art, not to show up at funerals and make speeches. Dylan also may have struggled with the fact that Hendrix died at 27 from a drug-related incident. Dylan himself had struggled with substance abuse in the mid-1960s. He He had been using amphetamines heavily during his electric tour. The motorcycle accident in 1966 may have saved his life by forcing him to stop. Dylan had pulled back from that destructive lifestyle. He had chosen survival and family over the rock and roll excess that killed so many. Hendrix's death was a reminder of what could have happened to Dylan if he had not changed course. That may have been uncomfortable for Dylan to confront publicly. Finally, there was the matter of the song itself. All Along the Watchtower had become Hendrix's song in the public imagination. Dylan had acknowledged this, but it also meant that Dylan's contribution was somewhat invisible. People who loved the Hendrix version often did not even know Dylan had written it. Dylan may have felt conflicted about this, grateful that Hendrix had made the song immortal, but also aware that he was seen as secondary to Hendrix's interpretation. Attending the funeral might have felt like acknowledging that second-hand status in a way that Dylan found uncomfortable. The pattern of silence. Bob Dylan's absence from Jimi Hendrix's funeral was not an isolated incident. It was part of a lifelong pattern of avoiding public mourning and tributes. When other musicians died, Dylan rarely issued statements. When Woody Guthrie, his greatest influence, died in 1967, Dylan attended a memorial concert but did not speak publicly about what Guthrie meant to him. When John Lennon was murdered in 1980, Dylan did not make a public statement. When George Harrison died in 2001, Dylan's tribute was brief and private. This was simply who Dylan was. He processed loss internally. He believed that his music was his statement about everything that mattered, that trying to put feelings into words for public consumption was a betrayal of genuine emotion. This approach frustrated people who wanted Dylan to be more open and accessible. Fans wanted to hear him talk about the musicians who had influenced him or who had died. Critics accused him of being cold and disconnected, but Dylan did not care about these criticisms. He had built his entire post-1966 career around refusing to be what other people wanted him to be. If people wanted public statements and emotional tributes, they could look elsewhere. Dylan would continue to make music, and let that be enough. Interestingly, Dylan did honor Hendrix in his own way. He continued to perform All Along the Watchtower for the rest of his career. He often introduced it in concerts as Jimi's song or played it with the intensity and electricity that Hendrix had brought to it. For Dylan, this was the real tribute, not showing up at a funeral or making a teary statement to the press, but keeping the music alive. Performing the song night after night for decades was Dylan's way of saying that Hendrix's contribution mattered, that it would not be forgotten, that the music would outlive both of them. Two ghosts passing. There is something haunting about the Dylan-Hendrix relationship. Two of the greatest musical minds of the 20th century connected through a single 3-minute song. They barely spoke to each other. They never collaborated beyond that one interpretation. But through All Along the Watchtower, they achieved something that neither could have done alone. Dylan's apocalyptic poetry met Hendrix's visionary guitar playing and created something that transcended both of them. The song became bigger than either artist. It became a standard that would be covered by hundreds of musicians in the decades to come, but it would always belong to Dylan and Hendrix, the poet who wrote it and the prophet who revealed its true power. Both men struggled with fame and expectation. Dylan dealt with it by disappearing, by refusing to be the spokesman or the leader or the public figure. Hendrix dealt with it by pushing himself harder and harder, by taking more drugs and playing louder and searching for sounds that existed just beyond his reach. Dylan chose survival. Hendrix did not survive. When Hendrix died at 27, he became frozen in time. Forever young and forever a genius who died too soon. Dylan lived on and grew old and continued to evolve and change. He became a Nobel Prize winner and an elder statesman of American music. Two completely different fates. The story of why Bob Dylan did not attend Jimi Hendrix's funeral is a story about two artists who connected deeply through music but remained strangers in life. It is about Dylan's lifelong commitment to privacy and his refusal to perform grief for public consumption. It is about the different ways people honor the dead. Some people attend funerals and give eulogies and make public statements. Others keep the work alive. Dylan chose the latter. He let All Along the Watchtower be his tribute to Hendrix. He played it thousands of times over the next 5 decades. Every time he performed it, he was acknowledging what Hendrix had done. Every note was a reminder that Jimi Hendrix had heard something in that song that no one else heard and had made it immortal. That was a greater tribute than any funeral appearance could ever be. What do you think about Bob Dylan's decision not to attend Jimi Hendrix's funeral? Was his private approach to grief more authentic than a public appearance would have been, or should he have made the effort to honor the man who transformed his song? Do you prefer Dylan's original version of All Along the Watchtower or Hendrix's electric interpretation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration of musical genius and complicated relationships, please hit the like button and share this video with fellow music lovers. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the legendary artists who shaped rock and roll history. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video. Goodbye.